Sorry, I was muted there. Welcome to Nuclear for Australia's exclusive Q&A for petition signatories with British nuclear advocate Xeon Lights. During this Q&A, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions to Xeon using the link you've all been sent via email or using the QR code, which will be above. We would also really appreciate if you could help us in our mission to legalise nuclear energy in Australia by sharing our petition with your friends and family and on social media using the link nuclearforaustralia.com/petition. With that, I will now introduce Xeon, and I'll bring her on to the stream. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Hi.
Xeon, for those who are unfamiliar with you, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Xeon, and I'm a science communicator with a long history of environmental work as well. And now one of the main things that I talk to people about is clean energy, specifically nuclear energy.
Could you explain, so you came from Extinction Rebellion. This is the first question. Why did you choose to leave that organisation, and why do you think that environmental organisations, as they refer to themselves, still oppose nuclear energy?
So my original reason for joining Extinction Rebellion was because they asked me to be a spokesperson, and that meant taking quite, significant speaking slots on television and various stages around the UK. And I felt that if I wasn't doing it, someone else would do it who would not necessarily be representing the science. So I was quite, I was happy to be offered that, and I took it on. But increasingly, I found it more difficult to talk about the issues when the organization itself was putting out misinformation. For example, just really overblown claims about climate change, like terrifying young people. I mean, this is kind of their strategy. I realized over time it wasn't an official strategy, but I realized it was a strategy, make everyone afraid, make them believe in apocalypse and societal breakdown, and then they'll act on climate change. So I had a lot of problems with that along the way, and it was always an ongoing debate on the inside. There were other people who agreed with me, so we kind of felt that maybe we could channel the direction of the organization and be more kind of solutions based, be more helpful. But ultimately I quit because I realized there were too many people who are on the other side who didn't want that, and who actually were quite happy to put out mistruths about climate change and climate related issues, so long as they felt it was, for the greater good, which I was very uncomfortable with. So I stepped away from that organization, and in that role, I couldn't talk about energy in that role. They very specifically believe that the solution to climate change is political revolution. Like, they don't say it like that, but that is what I came to realize as a core member of the group. And again, I disagreed with that. I mean, if you can't say climate change is really urgent, act now, and then say, well, first we need to completely overhaul the political system. And also I didn't feel that what they were suggesting instead was actually necessarily viable, or going to solve climate change, or be better for people. So I took umbrage with that fact as well. So there are many reasons, but ultimately, I couldn't talk about nuclear, which actually was some hypocrisy on the part of the organization, because they're quite happy to promote renewables, and they have done. But then when you ask about nuclear, they say, oh, we don't talk about solutions. So there's a lot going on there.
Wow, that's quite remarkable that they're not actually willing to discuss the solutions to the issues which they've, made everyone very much aware of, and to some extent for good reason. Why do you support nuclear energy, and what potential do you see nuclear energy playing around the world in solving climate change, and also, maintaining electrical grids around the world?
Well, I didn't used to support it. I came from an environmental background where people are very afraid of nuclear energy. There are a lot of myths. There's some brilliant work now kind of busting those myths. You're doing a lot of it yourself, Will, which is well done. But, for a long time, no one was doing that. Or if they weren't really getting any coverage. So we just believed all these ridiculous claims, which to us made nuclear more scary than fossil fuels. And plenty of people still believe that, when actually, when I started looking at the facts, I realized how misled I'd been, how misled we'd all been, really. that, you know, even taking into account all the worst disasters that have happened, all the meltdowns that have happened in history, that includes Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima, the death toll is under a few thousand. I'm not saying that those are, you know, those deaths don't matter. I'm not saying that, but you've got to put it in context of the deaths from fossil fuels, which from air pollution alone is millions, something like 9 million a year. And that's before you talk about climate change. That's before you talk about other impacts, you know, like from mining and from, you know, people who have to live in the regions where there are gas explosions and the Deepwater Horizon spill and all of these disasters. So really, I realized that it's not that scary. It's not that bad. We've been led to believe it through a combination of, you know, environmentalists frightening people because they'd been misled themselves. Some of them were doing it out of bad faith. You know, they have some vested interests, maybe links to fossil fuel industry. And yeah, if you're actually just honest about it, fossil fuels are the biggest, you know, problem. If you think, you know, I think future generations will look back and think, really, they burned coal for that long when they knew it causes cancers and respiratory issues and it gives kids asthma and, you know, air pollution, you know, massive, massive, scary thing that we're all subject to more than, you know, it's an invisible killer that we live with every day. You think about radiation, people fear it because they think it's an invisible killer, but actually we live with low levels of radiation every day, but it's highly, highly unlikely that you and I will ever be exposed to a large amount. Whereas it's quite likely that we'll be exposed to a large amount of air pollution if we go to any, you know, highly air polluted region in the world, or if there's something like a wildfire locally, or, you know, it's much more of a risk to us, and we don't have that same fear. And I think that's where kind of the environmental movement went wrong, is we should have focused on that. And, you know, I think future generations would think all those unnecessary deaths could have been prevented if we'd switched to nuclear, you know, 3 decades ago, 4 decades ago. Yeah, so all of these things over time changed my mind. And the more I looked into it, the more I learned about things like energy density. Again, Will's done brilliant explainers on this already. The more I became convinced, because there's also many other reasons that it's really good. For example, a small land footprint, good jobs for people. There's such a long list that you when you realize, you kind of think, wow, we really were fooled and tricked out of having this amazing kind of gift for humanity through misinformation, essentially.
Yeah. And the one thing I would say to everyone who's watching is definitely to follow Xion's Substack. I'm not sure, I'll try and share those details in our next email, but that's a great resource because Xion always, well, I know you were giving me a lot of shout outs there, but Xion, you've done some great work, of course, and I'll make sure to share that with people so that they can have more resources. Another question, and this is something, you know, a lot of those environmental organizations have, and this is a question from one of our audience members, is, you know, what about the waste? How do you manage the waste from nuclear reactors?
So this was one of the things that I had been misled on. There's a myth that the waste is really dangerous, really poorly managed. Actually, of all the energy sources, waste from nuclear energy is the most well managed. Now, there have been mistakes made with waste in the past, but that is actually from weapons. So in the UK, we have a site called Sellafield, quite a famous site, where the weapons waste was mismanaged. It's now all cleaned up. It's fine. It's very safe. It's very secure. But there was a period where it wasn't, you know, it was problematic. And people have confused that with waste from energy. Whereas if you look at somewhere like France, where they've had this intense nuclear program since the 1980s, they've never had a problem with waste. Nowhere in the world has had a problem where waste has killed anyone. You know, there's a lot of fears about waste, but it doesn't add up with the statistics. So actually, it is the most well managed of all the sources. It's basically put in a storage cask. I mean, there's a photo of me somewhere hugging one of these casks. It's huge. They're tested. These casks are so secure. They're tested by flying planes into them. And when they fly a plane into it, the cask doesn't even dent. And you can look these up on YouTube. You can put in nuclear storage cask test and you'll see it for yourself. Like, they're really secure. And you have to remember, it's a small, really small amount of waste that is in this massive cask. It's got several layers of shielding so that you can hug it, which I have done, and get no radiation. You're getting more radiation from the background radiation around you, or like, you know, banana in your pocket, than you are from the cask. So it's so ridiculously safe. And I mean, I remember when I went to see one and I went through all this paperwork and security and I went to see it. And I was just like, people are afraid of this. You know, it's ridiculously safe, ridiculous. You can't do anything with that. Even if you could somehow transport the cask and get into it, then there's a question of what are you going to do with a small amount of waste? It's ridiculously safe. And I think, again, you have to look at it in context that, you know, waste is a problem for everything, for every industry, for, you know, including outside energy. And the fact that it's so well managed is actually quite unusual. If you think a lot of appliances and things that we just send to landfill, we don't have a way of managing a lot of that waste, and often it is toxic. Same with solar panels. They technically can be recycled, but they're often not. They leach dangerous chemicals into landfill sites. I'm not saying we shouldn't have solar panels, I'm saying we should find a way to manage the waste, but no one's talking about it because they're not afraid of it. Everybody's talking about nuclear waste, which is highly well managed, which, you know, I always say to people, you can go and contact your nearest power plant and have a look for yourself. I mean, obviously in Australia you can't, but pretty much anywhere else in the world, if you're ever somewhere, just you can ask to have a look, and it's very reassuring actually. And the other thing that I think we have to remember is, yes, fine, solar panels, wind turbines, nuclear create waste, but we can manage it. We should manage it. Fossil fuel waste is being stored in the Earth's atmosphere. We are not managing it. We are breathing it in, and we are damaging our planet with it. So we really have to look at it in context.
Yeah. Another question is, and I know these are all currently negative questions, because I think it's important to, you know, bust some of those myths that people still believe. The cost and economic nuclear energy, people to your Substack, because you did a great piece on that, and I've just put a link on the YouTube and also on the live stream, as you may be able to see. But a question from Andrew is, a theme of the negative nuclear lobby is cost, both capital and running. What costings are available, referencing some of the newer and proven nuclear options?
So yeah, the best thing is to look at my cost piece. What about the cost that I wrote on Substack? Because it's got a lot of those references and a lot of those details in there. But I think we have to go back a step here. Regular nuclear is not expensive. So there's this myth that SMRs and advanced nuclear will be cheaper, and yeah, it will be. It can be very cheap depending on how it's deployed. But regular nuclear is also cheap. This is a myth that we've been told that it's super expensive. So basically, yes, there is an initial high cost investment. Yeah, fine. Like when you buy a house, there's initial high cost investment. But over time, when you pay that back with nuclear, you get a massive return, which is you get cheap electricity for people. Now, the best way to explain this is if you contrast it with wind and solar. If you have wind and solar power, you're paying for the turbines and the solar panels. So people say those are really cheap compared to a power plant, but that's not a fair comparison. So think about, how will those wind turbines and solar panels work? You have to connect them to the grid. Grid connections are super expensive. Nuclear can use the existing grid, which is why it's quite an easy transition from coal to nuclear. You have to set up fresh transmission lines. And I think actually you're having this debate in Australia at the moment where they're looking at cost, and it is very, very expensive for something that will be intermittent. Now, again, you're putting a lot of money, billions, into storage. So nobody counts that cost. Nuclear doesn't need that cost, right? It's all factored into your upfront cost. But with wind and solar, you have to add the storage capacity. That's lots of money for a few hours of storage, essentially. So it's still intermittent. Now that's, you know, people take that very personally, say it's very negative. That is just a fact. There is a way around it. You have something base load to back it up when it's not windy or it's not sunny. And that is either fossil fuels historically or it's nuclear energy. So realistically, what will end up happening is what Germany has done is, in order to have so many wind turbines and solar panels, they constantly keep coal on the back burner. They constantly keep gas. So they're paying for that. They are paying for that to exist, so that any day they can fire it up so that the hospitals don't fail and you don't have blackouts. That is a fact. That is what is going to end up happening in Australia. If you don't have something else, if you're not building nuclear, you are going to end up depending on fossil fuels for longer. And I think actually Chris Bowen has hinted at that, saying we're going to be on gas for a long time, which I think is really a shame when you have such a good, clean energy source that is very misrepresented and people are afraid of. As for, you know, if you look at what are upfront costs now? Look at the UAE. So again, I did a Substack piece on this about Baraka. So they just went. So the UAE, United Arab Emirates, very oil-rich nation. People criticize them saying they're very oil-rich. Why do they, how can they care about climate change? Actually, they didn't cause climate change. They've come to wealth recently. They're not the West that burned lots of fossil fuels for a long time, and they're already thinking ahead. They're thinking, well, how are we going to wean off of these things? So this is really good. So they've set their own net zero target. They did an independent report where they got their scientists to look at how are we going to transition, and they looked at these things and they realized renewables is not about just buying the panels and the turbines. It's about all of the grid, all of the storage, and all of the backup. So they actually decided to start a nuclear program. They never had a nuclear program before. They're part of the non-proliferation treaty, so they had to have all these negotiations with the UN and other bodies. And then they said, we have no expertise, we have no engineers, we have no. So they're very similar to Australia. In fact, no, Australia has more expertise because you have ANSTO, but they had no, they're starting from nothing. They have no industry. So it opened a bid. It's like something like 20 billion. Someone come in and help us. South Korea won because South Korea is really good at making nuclear power plants very cheaply and very quickly. That's a whole other topic. And they came in and they helped them build 4 reactors. It took, from the inception of the idea of that first report to actually them operating, it took 10 years total. So construction time was much smaller than that. But they went from nothing, set up an industry, get the engineers qualified, get them working on the project from scratch to where we are now with 4 reactors, which means 25% of their energy needs. So that's very quick. It came in at the cost they expected, and now they're thinking about making more and exporting to the regions around them, because obviously this is a very clever thing to do. But it can be done efficiently and quickly, and if it's done efficiently and quickly, then the cost is not so high. Often the cost comes up with delays when it's not done efficiently. And there are examples of that. We've done that in Britain with Hinkley Point, just constant delays. We have massive issues here with building anything, getting anything built on time and cost. We're having this with HS2, if anyone's heard of that. It's about the way that you choose to do it, not about the technology. The technology is very efficient and has been for a long time.
No, that's a very good point, especially at the end. There's no reason why nuclear energy has to be expensive if you want it to be cheap, if that's your objective. I'm not sure if you're able to comment on this, but there's a specific question in regards to thorium. And the question from Kevin is, are there any countries developing thorium reactors, and how plentiful are thorium supplies?
There are a number of countries, a number of SMR startups that are working with thorium reactors, and there is plentiful. Thorium's plentiful. I'm always being messaged by thorium people actually saying, you have to look into this, it's really important. And I agree. And I think at the moment there's a race going on with SMRs. There are different types of SMRs, and we don't know yet which one will be successful and will be the startup that people start deploying everywhere. Which will be the best kind of proven cost-effective form of energy. So it might be molten salt, it might be thorium, it might be something else. Time will tell, but certainly it's viable, and certainly people are building them.
Another question, and so what for someone who's unfamiliar with this topic, why does it seem that around the world there's so many countries shutting down nuclear reactors, whether that be in the UK, in the US? Obviously there's been investments, especially in next generation nuclear, but why have so many countries, and even another example is Germany, decide to shut down their reactors? And do you think that can be taken as what does that say about nuclear more broadly?
Well, so I think there's 2 things happening. A lot of countries are coming to nuclear for the first time, like the UAE. India's just put online its own indigenous design of reactor. A lot of the East, actually, China's building a lot of nuclear reactors. Yes, they have a lot of coal, but they're already thinking air pollution's not great. Let's start thinking about the transition. Whereas if you look in the West, a lot of us just stopped thinking about the transition. Now we're being pushed to do it because of net zero. But for air pollution alone, we should have done it a long time ago. And that has come from years of misinformation from the environmental movement. I think it's the worst thing they ever did. And those fears have bled into pop culture. So, you know, The Simpsons, the China Syndrome, there's a lot of pop culture, there's a lot of disaster movies that start with some unknown kind of nuclear bad thing happen. People confuse weapons with energy. So the bad feeling, you know, around nuclear has been so significant that it's affected everyone, including politicians. And so I think, especially with, you know, green parties, which almost every green party in the world protest nuclear, like they have it in their manifesto, except for the Finnish Green Party, who recently changed their mind, which is a different topic, but I have also written an article on that. And what happened is the politicians fell for the misinformation. They went with their feelings instead of with facts. It's very easy to do, to be honest. I would say often that's how it works. People do naturally go with feelings over facts, and that those facts weren't readily available. So people like me, who's quite rational and logical, didn't really have access to that information until I started looking into it myself and created some of those opportunities. And now there are lots of people like Will having those conversations. And now a lot of those politicians are starting to rethink. But it's a big thing to change your mind, especially, you know, when you're in that position of power, and to say, actually, I was wrong. And Germany was wrong. There's no doubt that Germany was wrong. They made the decision in 2011 to phase out their entire nuclear fleet. And that was, you know, because a tsunami hit a nuclear power plant, Fukushima Daiichi power plant in Japan. Okay, I understand that that's scary, but no one died because of the Fukushima meltdown. There was a lot of panic about it. There were a lot of people who panicked, and in the process of panicking and like getting in cars and getting into accidents, they did die because they were so afraid. So that's, you know, real great irony there. No one was harmed because of the power plant. People were harmed because of the tsunami. You know, that's very sad. But Germany is not going to experience a tsunami. You know, geographically, it doesn't experience these conditions. So it really is a very kind of, you know, fear, emotion-led decision that the politicians made. We'll phase them out. We'll put loads of money. We'll put billions and billions into renewables. That's going to work for us. And it hasn't worked for them, as you've probably seen what happened in Lutzeroth, where they cleared an entire village to mine for coal, and they're using lignite coal, which is the dirtiest coal, because it's backfired so exponentially. They have nothing to replace that nuclear generation that they've shut down. They have no base load. The renewables, even with storage, cannot supply the same amount of energy. So they've fallen back on coal. So their emissions are sky high now. This is an example of what not to do, you know, frankly. And it is just a fear-based response based on believing misinformation, which is bad. It's good and it's bad. It's bad, obviously, because it's had real life repercussions. The renowned climate scientist James Hansen, he crunched the numbers on the number of deaths from the shutdown of nuclear power plants post Fukushima in Germany and Japan, and he said thousands of people died a month from air pollution alone because they shut down the nuclear and it always was replaced with coal. So there are real life repercussions, but on the other hand, there are a lot of people, you know, addressing the misinformation now, which I would say 10 years ago, no one was doing. Like it was much harder to get access to the right information. The fact that that's happening now, and this debate's happening, for example, in Australia, you know, finally, I find that very promising. And I think, you know, eventually the truth will win out, I think.
I've just got 3 more questions for you, Zion, because I understand that you've got something else to do after this. The third last question is from an anonymous questioner. How can we keep nuclear reactors cool in a place like Australia with many water competing interests?
I mean, so you could ask the UAE, because it's a very similar hot, dry climate. Actually, again, they're looking at something very clever, which is building desalination plants. This is really interesting. It's worth looking into if you don't know a lot about it. Basically, it is an energy intensive way of creating drinking water. There are people who don't like it. It's large infrastructure, it's expensive, but frankly, a lot of dry regions are going to experience water shortages more commonly and should be building desalination plants anyway, even if they're just there in reserve for now. You cannot run them without a huge amount of energy. And that's kind of in the back of the mind of these countries in the East, like the UAE, thinking, you know, I saw in their original documents where they're discussing nuclear, well, then we can also have desalination because nuclear will be able to provide that. So, water is going to be a problem globally. there is a solution, but it's an energy intensive solution. So it still comes back to you're going to need a lot of energy. Instead of planning for less, yeah, sure, you can have less emissions, but don't plan for less electricity, because actually we're very good at finding ways to increase our electricity use. For example, look at AI now. AI is very energy intensive. That's not going away. That's here to stay. We need to think about meeting those needs in a way that is best for people and planet, which is by using clean energy instead of burning fossil fuels.
How can pro-nuclear advocates move the needle in Australia? In particular, how could the Australian Labor Party be moved?
I think just having the discussions is really important. If you have a local Labour representative, get in touch with them, have a conversation about it. They won't change their mind straight away. Nobody does. But chipping away and giving little bits of information, being friendly about it, actually that can go a long way, because a lot of politicians don't have a science background. In fact, most politicians don't. They're not highly science literate. They don't necessarily understand the basics, and they, just like a lot of us, they believed misinformation. So you can have those conversations, and I think it can go a long way. Sometimes you'll come across someone who just, they're definitely never going to change their mind. Don't bother with that person. You can usually tell who they are. A small number of people, it's a fundamental belief, you will not be able to change it, but most people have the conversations. The Labour Party in Britain is very pro-nuclear, has it in its manifesto. You have Keir Starmer speaking very openly about it, and before him Ed Miliband, and lots of other Labour politicians have always been very vocal about it. And although it's not new, Tony Blair was pro-nuclear a decade ago, speaking very openly about it. It's not new, but what I would say is they're much louder about it now. And that's because people have contacted them and have said, actually, what about this? And they said, we already agree with that. We're going to be more vocal about it. So you might be surprised at how many people do kind of think, well, yeah, we don't want to do what Germany did, but they don't want to upset their voters. So if you show that you're a voter and you will back them if they support nuclear, that's all they want to hear. That's politics, isn't it?
True. And the last question, and I'm going to be a bit sneaky and try and fit two questions into one, but give us a really short elevator pitch for why Australia should lift the ban on nuclear energy, and are you optimistic that Australian politicians will lift the ban?
Australia, in my mind, is a nuclear nation already. You have ANSTO, you have AUKUS now, you're developing the expertise, you have an incredible research reactor, you have a lot of coal-fired power stations that you're quite rightly wanting to transition away from. There is a DOE, Department of Energy report from America, where they looked at doing this there, and they found that the transition from coal there to nuclear would be so easy and efficient, especially for bringing along workers, not leaving them behind, just basic retraining for them. So you get to keep jobs, you get to transition to a clean energy source. And also, Australia specifically, you have a lot of uranium. You have this at home. You're selling this to other countries so that they can have energy dense, reliable electricity. To me, you're just such a small step away. If the UAE can do it, going from nothing, you're not starting at nothing. I think actually, if that decision's made, you could probably decarbonize as quickly as France did in the 1980s. About a decade, completely decarbonized, and then exporting electricity to all the regions around it. That's France. I am hopeful that it will be lifted, whether it's now or in several years. Obviously, we all want it to be now. But if it is lifted, you could very quickly do something similar to what the UAE has done. And you could be a world leader, I think, in nuclear energy if you really wanted to be.
Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening, Zion, and for answering everyone's questions so thoroughly. That now concludes our Q&A, and for a final time, thank you for joining.
Thank you.
We'll say
thank you so much.
Goodbye now.
Bye.
In case you missed any of the live stream tonight or would like to watch it again, we'll be emailing all of you a private copy in our next email update. Please also remember to sign and share our petition to legalise nuclear energy at nuclearforaustralia.com/petition. And you can head to our website at nuclearforaustralia.com to learn more. Thank you very much for your support this evening and for watching our Q&A. As a reminder to please sign and share our petition. Thank you very much.